Canto 11. Topics: God's providence at every moment, every sin's victim, and truth as a building block of society. God makes use of all things. Everything, even what we consider despicable and evil, becomes an element in his providential plan. God transforms Judas's betrayal, the plotting of the scribes and Pharisees, and Pontius Pilate's washing his hands of responsibility, and remolds them into the means of our salvation. And every moment of time is useful as well. God has some function in our delays, our unexpectedly being stuck in traffic, and He knows it is happening, and He has included it in His plan for us from all eternity. What spiritual use can we make of this moment? In line 1, these broken stones are yet another instance of the damage done in hell during our Lord's descent. Hell is filled with visible reminders of the saving death of Christ and His power over death. The damage He left behind in hell becomes a stepping stone for Dante on his journey. We are told something important about the sins punished in the next area of hell by the imagery. First, unlike the terraces that distinguish the different sins of the passions, here the next circle of hell He is at the bottom of a steep pit. Whatever sins are yet to come are significantly different from what He has come from before, as symbolized by the physical distance we must travel to arrive at the circle. Second, the sins are characterized by an overwhelming stink, which is so strong that it makes our travelers step back and wait until their sense of smell grows accustomed to it. Clearly, the sins punished here are particularly foul. They carry with them some sort of decay, something rotten to the core. Even good people like Dante and Virgil grow accustomed to the odor of sin when given the opportunity. It offends at the beginning, and it can even be overwhelmingly repulsive. But we grow used to it with time. This provides us with compelling reason to avoid the occasions of sin. We do not want to allow ourselves to become callous to the evil our consciences perceive. But the longer we stay around the sin, the greater the chance that we stop noticing the smell of decay. It is good to see Dante taking the initiative. He's beginning to recognize that there is an urgency in his life. Time is valuable. He needs to derive spiritual benefit from it. Modern society has moved away from the criminalization of what many would call victimless crimes. These crimes might involve consensual sex or drug use or any number of other hidden activities. But the argument is basically the same. It isn't hurting anyone. But is that true? The Christian tradition would say no. There are no victimless crimes. Every sin damages the sinner, even if we gleefully pursue it. As God's creature, when we damage what He has made and loves, we offend Him. The more profound the damage, the greater the offense. Whether or not these sins should be against the law is debatable, but we as Christians cannot lose sight of the fact that they are wrong and destructive. They are no less harmful or sad just because the harm is so often self-inflicted. Virgil uses this time of acclimatizing to the smell to give Dante a sort of hellish geography lesson, describing in a systematic way the lay of the land of the remaining parts of hell. There is a logical ordering to hell based upon the destructive power of sin, destructive not only to those against whom we sin, but primarily to ourselves. Sin destroys or rots the sinner. The greater and more incurable the damage to the sinner, the greater the sin. This intrinsic damage to the sinner's humanity is the underlying criterion for the organization of hell. Virgil begins with the genus of all remaining sins to be encountered in hell. Malice, a type of sin that has injustice as its goal. All that follows is a subdivision of this, The genus of malice is divided into two species according to the instrument or means by which the malice is done, either by force or violence, or by fraud. Dante considers fraud to be worse than violence. This position is perhaps a shock to modern sensibilities. But the reason Virgil offers in explanation might be as perplexing as the statement itself, since fraud's a sin peculiar to mankind. As we'll continue to see, Dante, in a way very unfamiliar to modern ears, judges the severity of a sin not so much by the damage it does to others, and certainly not by the damage it does to God, but by the damage it does to our humanity. In this way of thinking, every sin has a victim. Every sin harms someone, the sinners. Where is the spiritual rot? Is it relatively superficial, as in the case of the sins of the passions? The reason and will still remain whole and still have the opportunity to direct the passions. At the core of the person, there is still a force for good. This is why these sins are punished higher in hell, that is, less severely. However, what about a sin that strikes more at the heart of what it means to be human? The sins that do are more serious. Malicious sins are a defect of the will itself, the will that is supposed to be the power that has command over the passions. How can things go right when the commanding power itself is corrupt? Fraud, even though it might seem to cause less damage to the outside world, is more destructive to the sinner himself. In fraud, reason itself is the instrument of sin, destroying the trust that is necessary for human society. Man, a social being, cannot exist without this network of connections. Notice that violence against a person and violence against his property are punished together. This is a very Christian and particularly medieval idea. The very foundation for the right of personal property is that having some basic amount of material goods is necessary to preserve both life and the freedom to decide how our lives are lived. If someone else owns what we need, we'll never be free. This is the justification of the Church's rejection of communism. The dignity of the individual requires individual possession of property. To take someone's possessions, therefore, is to take something necessary for life. We can also see how our property is part of ourselves when we think about the change that happens in our lives when we have been victims of robbery. Even if there was no violence against our person, we feel violated, our security shattered, and our privacy stripped away. Those who are violent against themselves are worse than those who are violent against others. Again, this is not a very modern view, as we are increasingly moving toward the sanctioning of a right to die in this world, a right to decide for ourselves when and how our life ends. The assumption is that our life belongs to us, and so we should be free in how we treat it and when we reject it. Taking someone else's life, however, is a violation of their freedom. The key to understanding Dante's view is that it is far more basic in our humanity to respect our own life than to respect the life of others. If we don't value the life we have, a life of which we have firsthand experience, we'll never value the life of our neighbor. Suicide strikes closer to the core than homicide does. We have a natural desire for self-preservation. Again, the same association of sins against a person and against his property holds true. Suicides and spendthrifts who spend money in an extravagant way, wasteful or irresponsible way, are punished together here. Both have rejected the gift of life that was entrusted to them by God. Violence against God is obviously not violence against God himself, because that is impossible, but against his creation and his will. We can sin by violence against God by acting against nature itself, or against nature's goods, or directly against God as he reveals himself. The poster child for sins against nature is sodomy in all its forms, turning what is supposed to be a life giving action into something sterile. The user sins against nature's good by taking something that is supposed to be sterile, money, and trying to make it fertile. And blasphemers rage against God and his will directly. This ring, with its three subsets, would be most entirely overlooked by the modern world, with its existentialist rejection of any idea of a fixed human nature, or of natures in general. If sins against nature are in fact sins of violence against God, then we see these sins against nature proliferate and even be accepted as normal by large segments of society. Perhaps we should not be surprised to see a rise in anger against God and his religion, and a corresponding rise in the persecution that results from that anger. Lying has become a standard practice in business and politics. Many people explore the boundaries of lying every time they fill out tax forms. Telling the truth seems like giving the competition an unfair advantage or giving the government more than it deserves. And so twisting the truth is something almost everyone does. But what happens as a result of this general acceptance of lying? Well, the bonds of trust are gradually weakened, and our relationships become increasingly adversarial. We become competitors rather than cooperators. And line 52, it opens with "now fraud," which bites at every conscience. This phrase seems to open several interpretations. First, it is something that everyone does, and as a result, fraud is something by which every conscience ought to be bothered. And second, perhaps fraud gnaws at conscience in a way that the fraudulent can't help but notice. We are using our reason to sin. How can we not notice? Or finally, perhaps fraud eats away at conscience, gradually separating us from that sense of connectedness that helps to keep us on the right track. At the beginning, fraud is certainly something of which the sinner must be aware, but as time goes on, he seems to notice less and less. Recall Dante and Virgil gradually becoming accustomed to the stench at the edge of the pit of hell. Fraud can either abuse the general trust that one human being should be able to have for another, or it can abuse or violate a special bond of trust. For example, that between friends or family members. The first is called simple fraud, and the latter, because it breaks a twofold bond, complex fraud. Fraud seems to be worse, according to Dante, than violence because it is more destructive of what it means to be human. When we take part in fraud in a consistent and habitual way, something inside of us dies. Our connection with our fellow man is broken. Violence might be able to be justified in other ways, but fraud is rotten to the core. The more fundamental the bonds we betray, the worse is the fraud. There are bonds we have with many human beings, precisely because we are sharers in human nature. But there are bonds which are more profound, that give us a special connection to people, like family, friends, or guests. Betraying these bonds is a special act of treachery. Incontinence, or sins of the passion, offend God to a lesser degree because they don't reach so deeply in man's nature. In these sins, the passions overwhelm reason. With sins of malice, the reason itself is the problem. When Dante was writing, however, the understanding of money was developing rapidly. We are so accustomed to think of money as an asset like any other, something we can invest wisely. Make your money work as hard as you do, says one bank advertisement. Dante, as we'll see more of later, is noticeably more old-fashioned than St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, in this regard. For Dante, possession comes from human industry, what we add to the value of things. Work is part of what we were called to do in the Garden of Eden. The fall isn't the reason we have to work. It is merely the reason that work is considered burdensome.